"You really thought you could touch my creek and get away with it," I muttered under my breath, the metallic taste of adrenaline already sharp on my tongue as I drove down the winding gravel road that led to the back 40 of my property. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and at the end don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10, enjoy the story. The early morning fog hung low over the rolling hills, the damp scent of wet earth mixing with the faint sweetness of wildflowers that still managed to bloom along the banks of the creek. My boots crunched against the gravel as I stepped out of the truck, the cool air clinging to my skin, and the distant hum of cicadas filling the silence, a soundtrack to the tension building in my chest. I'd been gone for a week on a short engineering project, trusting that my little slice of Texas paradise, my land, my creek, and every inch of inherited farmland, would be left alone. But as I approached the water, my stomach tightened into a knot. The once clear creek that ran like liquid glass across the property now shimmered an unnatural shade of green, a chemical stench wafting toward me, making me cough and instinctively cover my nose. Fish floated lifelessly on the surface, their scales catching the morning sun in eerie flashes of silver and blue, while small insects struggled against the oily film that coated the water. I crouched beside the bank, feeling the damp soil beneath my hands, tracing the water's edge and noticing the faint powdery residue that betrayed the presence of some foul substance. And then I saw her, Viven Ashworth, perched in her little white golf cart like some suburban queen surveying conquered land, the smirk on her face as practiced and sharp as a scalpel. Her pearl-white gloves rested on the steering wheel, a contrast to the dark stains she'd left in my creek, and the scent of her expensive perfume mingled with the acrid chemical, a cloud that hovered over the water like an accusation. She waved at me with the casual air of someone who had no idea of the storm about to hit her world, oblivious to the federal and local water rights quietly stacked in my favor, the legal leverage my family had held for over a century waiting to be deployed. I could hear the distant clatter of a rake in the garden and the subtle buzz of bees disturbed by the contamination, the creek's usual gentle babble replaced by a viscous, unnatural hiss. I inhaled deeply, feeling the cool morning air mix with the tension, and I thought about every detail, every legal paper tucked away in my grandfather's filing cabinet, every early morning I had spent measuring the flow of this very water, every engineering project that had trained me to notice the smallest shift in current or pH. Today, all that expertise was going to matter more than ever. I straightened, brushing dirt from my jeans, the sunlight glinting off the creek and highlighting the unnatural color, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a property dispute. This was a test of patience, of preparation, and of knowing exactly what leverage one holds. The cicadas seemed to hush as I surveyed the damage, the faint rustle of leaves carrying a whisper of wind that felt almost like encouragement. Every instinct in me, honed from years of tending this land and respecting its rhythms, told me exactly how to respond. I stepped back onto the gravel, the weight of history pressing against my shoulders, and I knew the next moves would be precise, calculated, and inevitable. Viven might have thought this was her morning victory, but she hadn't counted on me, Ethan Parker, knowing every inch of this creek, every twist and turn of the waterway, and the legal authority that came with it. The sun broke fully over the horizon, glinting off the water and casting long shadows of the surrounding oak trees, and I felt the subtle electric thrill of planning a counterstrike, knowing the creek itself would play a part in the retribution that would be coming, not loud, not hasty, but perfectly measured and unavoidable. The sun had climbed higher over the rolling hills, casting warm rays across the property and glinting off the dense forest that framed the edges of the creek. I walked slowly along the bank, feeling the damp soil give slightly under my boots, each step a reminder of how familiar this land was to me. My hands brushed the tall grasses and wildflowers that had persisted despite the disturbance, their resilience a silent lesson in patience and perseverance. I thought about my grandfather, who had spent decades carefully maintaining this property, teaching me to respect the flow of water, the patterns of rainfall, and the way a creek could shape the life around it. Every measurement I had ever taken, every survey I had conducted in my youth, came rushing back as a series of mental notes and observations. The patterns in the sediment, the subtle changes in the water level, the way certain plants leaned toward the sunlight, all spoke to the health of the ecosystem that had been disrupted. I could taste the crisp morning air, carry the faint scent of pine needles and fresh earth, and hear the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, each element anchoring me in the reality of the land I loved. The farmhouse sat a short walk away, its weathered wooden siding warmed by the sun, a reminder of decades of care and family history. I remembered walking these fields as a child, learning to measure distances with my grandfather, to notice the subtle dips where water pooled after rain, and the rise where the sun warmed the soil for crops. That knowledge was more than practical, it was a connection to the people who had come before me, who had trusted me to maintain their legacy. As I rounded a bend in the creek, I noticed small details that others might have missed, a cluster of stones slightly dislodged, a faint discoloration in the water where something had recently disturbed the flow, and the way certain plants had wilted while others remained unaffected. Each observation was a clue, a piece of the puzzle that I would need to restore balance. I knelt to examine the soil, running my fingers through the cool mud, feeling the texture shift between dry and moist areas, the faint grain of sand and silt a story in itself. It occurred to me that the land was speaking, if only one knew how to listen, and I had been listening my entire life. The distant hum of a lawnmower on the neighboring property reminded me that time continued even in moments like this, a constant undercurrent alongside the stillness of the creek. I let my mind wander through every legal document my family had preserved, every water right and easement that had been quietly recorded over decades, understanding that the power of these papers was as real as the water flowing before me. The knowledge that I held authority not just through ownership but through meticulous documentation gave me a quiet confidence. I stood slowly, brushing off my hands and letting the sunlight warm my back, feeling the anticipation of what was to come settle into a measured determination. The creek, the land, the farmhouse, and every tree and rock on the property were silent allies, and I was prepared to act with the precision and patience that years of stewardship had taught me. Each detail mattered, from the slight bend in the creek to the angle of sunlight through the trees, and I knew that understanding these nuances would allow me to reclaim control and ensure the legacy of this land would endure. As I continued along the edge of the creek, my eyes caught every subtle shift in the landscape, the way sunlight fractured through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground that made the green-tinged water glimmer in a way that seemed almost surreal. The faint rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, and the soft whistle of wind threading through the tall oaks reminded me how deeply connected I was to this place. Every rock and bend in the creek had been etched into my memory from countless hours spent surveying and maintaining the land, and now each one told a story of intrusion and misuse. I could see the small ripple of water where the contamination had disrupted the natural flow, the gentle slope that had once guided the stream perfectly over the sediment, now skewed by foreign chemicals that did not belong. My mind raced through every inspection and record I had, every engineering principle I had learned and applied over the years, and how those skills could now be turned into a strategy to restore balance and reclaim what was mine. I knelt again by the bank, letting my fingers trail through the water cautiously, feeling the difference in temperature and consistency, a subtle yet telling signal of the presence of foreign elements. The creek seemed to respond to my observation, the currents revealing the path of contamination, as though the land itself wanted me to understand and act. From a distance, the farmhouse stood proudly, its roof catching the morning light, windows reflecting the blue of the sky, a steadfast reminder of the generations that had walked these grounds and the legacy that rested on my shoulders. I considered the role of the legal documents my family had preserved, the easements and water rights that granted not only ownership but authority over the use of these natural resources, and I realized that knowledge was as much a tool as any physical action I might take. As I traced the waterway, noting where small tributaries fed into the main creek, I could see the interconnectedness of the land, the way each small decision or intrusion upstream could ripple down and impact the ecosystem, the crops, and the livestock that relied on it. The soft hum of insects and the occasional splash of a frog landing in the water punctuated the quiet, reminding me that life still persisted here, and that restoring it would require careful planning, precise execution, and patience. I stood slowly, brushing off my hands, feeling the energy of the morning sun on my back, the earth firm beneath my boots, and the gentle sway of branches overhead, and I understood that this was more than a confrontation over property, it was a meticulous dance of cause and effect, observation and intervention. Every detail mattered, from the subtle discoloration in the water to the angle of light on the creek bed, and I knew that by using my knowledge, experience, and careful attention to these nuances, I could begin to tip the balance back in my favor. The land itself seemed to lean toward me, guiding each step, and I felt a quiet resolve build inside, knowing that with every careful move, I was preparing to turn the tables in a way that would honor the history of this place and the stewardship I had inherited. The subtle sound of water moving over rocks was almost drowned out by the rhythmic tapping of my boots on the gravel path as I made my way back to the farmhouse, the morning light now stretching across the pasture and catching every dewdrop on the tall grasses. I paused for a moment, inhaling the crisp air, tasting the faint iron tang of the creek, and feeling the warm sun on my face, and I realized how much this land had become a part of me, how deeply every memory, every lesson learned here, shaped my understanding of balance and stewardship. The farmhouse windows reflected the sky in perfect clarity, the wood warmed to a golden hue, reminding me that generations had worked tirelessly to maintain this property, and that responsibility now rested on my shoulders. I thought about Viven, perched in her golf cart earlier, her eyes scanning the creek with a false sense of control, oblivious to the network of knowledge, experience, and legal authority that I had quietly accumulated over decades. Each legal document, each water right, each easement filed with the county represented a silent force ready to be applied in the right moment, and I felt the weight of that authority pressing not as a burden, but as a tool. I walked past the small orchard near the creek, noting the way the leaves had curled slightly from the chemical residue, and the subtle discoloration in the soil that spoke of intrusion, and I thought about how each of these details would guide the actions I would take to restore the natural order. The gentle rustle of the trees, the distant murmur of the creek as it threaded through the landscape, the occasional flash of a bird moving between branches, all contributed to a sense of awareness that sharpened my focus. I checked the alignment of the old wooden fence that bordered the property, each post standing firm, a reminder of the boundaries that defined my inheritance, both literal and symbolic. The smell of pine and earth mingled with the faint metallic hint from the disturbed water, a reminder that attention to sensory detail was as important as knowledge of law and engineering. I let my hands brush over the rough bark of a tree, feeling the texture and grounding myself in the present moment, appreciating the subtle changes in the terrain that might indicate further disruption. Each observation became part of a mental map, a strategy forming in real time, calculating flow, impact, and leverage. I thought about the small communities downstream, neighbors who depended on this creek for livestock, irrigation, and gardens, and the quiet responsibility that came with ensuring their well-being alongside my own. As I stood surveying the scene, a quiet determination settled into my chest, the kind that comes not from anger, but from careful calculation, preparation, and a deep understanding of the tools at my disposal. The land, the water, the farmhouse, and every plant and stone around me were allies in this process, and I knew that by observing, understanding, and applying my expertise, I could begin to correct the imbalance, restore what had been compromised, and assert the authority that had been quietly waiting all along. The afternoon sun now climbing higher cast longer shadows, painting the landscape in sharp contrast and highlighting every contour of the terrain, every ripple in the water, every detail that could be used to my advantage as I prepared for the next step in reclaiming control. Despite my careful documentation and repeated attempts to communicate the problem to the local authorities, the initial responses were frustratingly slow and often inconclusive, leaving me with the unnerving feeling that the situation was growing more complex by the hour. I had submitted water samples, photographs of discoloration, and detailed notes about the creek's flow and surrounding vegetation, but the review process moved at the pace of bureaucracy, not the urgent rhythms of nature that demanded attention. I sat on the porch of the farmhouse, the rough wooden boards warm beneath my hands, staring at the water that shimmered under the midday sun, and reflected on how many small details I had meticulously recorded over the years that could provide irrefutable evidence of my family's stewardship and the intrusion caused by Viven. The scent of fresh earth from the recent rain mingled with the faint chemical tang lingering in the creek, a subtle reminder that observation alone would not be enough to restore balance. Action was required. I began to review the old survey maps and property deeds again, tracing the flow of the creek through the boundaries of my land, noting every easement, historical water right, and legally defined channel that had been preserved by generations before me. Each line on the map, each annotation in the margin, provided clarity and a roadmap for how I could exert control over the water flow without overstepping legal bounds, ensuring that my intervention would be both effective and unquestionable. My fingers traced the embossed signatures on the aged documents, the faint indentation of the ink still discernible, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on my shoulders, a tangible connection to the past that reinforced the authority I possessed over this land. Walking along the creek again, I measured the angles of the banks, noting the subtle changes in slope, the sediment displacement, and the way certain plants had adapted to the altered flow, creating natural indicators of both damage and potential recovery. The rustle of leaves and the distant call of a hawk provided a soundtrack to my analysis, the ambient sounds of the environment sharpening my awareness, reminding me that every movement I made, every intervention I planned, would ripple through the ecosystem in ways both visible and hidden. I considered the downstream neighbors, their reliance on the creek for irrigation and livestock, and how their welfare was intertwined with the decisions I was about to make. The soft splash of water over a small rock reminded me that even minor adjustments could have significant consequences, and that meticulous planning was necessary to restore balance. Each observation, every carefully collected piece of evidence, and the legal leverage inherent in the water rights combined to form a strategy that would allow me to respond decisively. Standing on the bank, feeling the texture of the damp soil beneath my boots and the warmth of the sun on my back, I let the patterns of the land and water align in my mind, visualizing the interventions that would restore control, ensure sustainability, and reaffirm the authority my family had long held, all while honoring the natural flow of this creek and the legacy entrusted to me. I spent the afternoon going through every detail of the property records, water rights, and historical permits, each document a tangible link to decades of careful stewardship by my family. The sunlight shifted across the land, highlighting the gentle rise and fall of the hills, and the shadows from the trees cast intricate patterns across the soil, offering subtle indicators of where the creek's natural flow had been altered. I traced my fingers along the embossed edges of the deeds, noting the precise wording that established the senior rights to the water and the authority to regulate its usage, understanding that these papers were not merely historical artifacts, but legal instruments with real-world consequences. With a map spread across the old oak table in the farmhouse, I marked the points where the creek intersected my property lines, identifying the areas where flow had been redirected or impeded, and calculating the adjustments that would allow me to restore balance while remaining entirely within the bounds of the law. The faint scent of pine and damp earth filled the room, mixing with the subtle metallic hint from the disturbed water outside, a constant reminder that observation and preparation were inseparable from action. I stepped outside to inspect the creek once more, kneeling to examine the sediment and the minor discolorations along the banks, each one a clue that informed my plan, each ripple in the water reflecting the precision required to implement it successfully. The soft hum of insects and the distant cry of a hawk punctuated the quiet, focusing my attention on the interconnectedness of the land, the creek, and the surrounding ecosystem. I thought about the downstream neighbors who relied on the creek for irrigation, livestock, and daily use, and how their well-being was tied directly to the steps I was about to take, reinforcing the responsibility that came with control. I began outlining the interventions in my mind, considering the placement of temporary barriers, the adjustments to sluices and gates, and the timing of each action to ensure the natural flow was respected and restored without unnecessary disruption. Every measurement, every calculation, and every legal detail came together as a cohesive strategy, the plan forming like a carefully orchestrated sequence of movements, each one precise, deliberate, and purposeful. As the sun lowered slightly toward the horizon, the warm light accentuating the contours of the hills and the reflective surface of the creek, I felt a growing sense of clarity and anticipation. The knowledge that I possessed both the authority and the means to act responsibly instilled a quiet confidence, a sense that the careful preparation and attention to detail would yield results that were just, effective, and undeniable. Standing on the bank, the soil cool beneath my boots and the wind carrying the subtle scents of pine, earth, and water, I visualized the restoration of the creek's natural flow, the confirmation of my legal rights, and the reassurance that every move I made would honor the legacy of this land while asserting control in a manner that was measured, intelligent, and inevitable. By late afternoon, the sun had lowered enough that the golden light stretched across the pasture, turning the rolling hills into long, soft shadows that mirrored the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the landscape. I moved deliberately along the banks, carefully positioning the temporary barriers I had prepared, adjusting small wooden sluices and channels to redirect the flow in a controlled manner, letting the creek regain its natural rhythm without overstepping any legal or environmental boundaries. The subtle burble of water over the rocks grew steadier, clearer, and the faint metallic tang that had lingered for days began to fade, replaced by the fresh, earthy scent of flowing water. Each adjustment, each careful placement of boards and stones, felt like a conversation with the land itself, the water responding predictably, the plants leaning toward the returning current, and the small creatures cautiously emerging from the banks, reassured by the restoration of balance. I paused to observe, letting the soft hum of the creek and the gentle rustle of leaves inform my next move, noticing how the sediment settled naturally and the surface shimmered under the sunlight, reflecting the deep blues and greens of the surrounding forest. In the distance, Viven could be seen on the edge of her property, watching with a mixture of disbelief and hesitation, unable to comprehend how the system I had quietly constructed could function without interfering with the legal framework she assumed gave her control. I took a moment to admire the precision of the work, the way the historical water rights and easements intertwined seamlessly with the physical adjustments, reinforcing my authority without any confrontation, a demonstration of preparation, patience, and understanding of the ecosystem. The creek flowed steadily now, splitting naturally around the small obstacles I had set, feeding the ponds and irrigation channels downstream, the community that depended on this water benefiting without disruption, and the sense of calm that returned to the land was almost tangible, the gentle lap of water against the banks providing a steady rhythm that contrasted with the earlier tension. I walked the length of the creek one last time, checking the minor tributaries, the plant health, and the overall distribution of water, confident that every detail had been accounted for and that the legal and environmental considerations aligned perfectly. The farmhouse, bathed in the warm afternoon light, felt even more like a center of stewardship, a place where the balance of human activity and nature could coexist, guided by knowledge and careful management. The shadows lengthened, the light softened, and the water sparkled in a way that felt like quiet affirmation of the work completed. I stood on the bank, feeling the firm earth beneath my boots, listening to the steady murmur of the creek, the subtle chirp of crickets in the distance, and the occasional call of a bird overhead, knowing that the land had responded as it was meant to, that control and authority had been quietly but firmly restored, and that every small action had contributed to a larger, inevitable outcome that honored the legacy of my family and the integrity of the property. By the time the late afternoon sun began to sink behind the distant hills, casting long golden rays across the pasture, the creek had returned to a steady, clear flow, the water glinting like liquid glass as it wound past the oak trees and the small orchard. I walked the length of the restored banks, noting how each adjustment, every sluice and barrier I had set, worked in perfect harmony with the natural slope and contours of the land. The subtle ripple of water over the stones created a rhythmic melody, accompanied by the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead, a soundtrack that made the scene feel alive and responsive. I paused near the largest bend, the air carrying the soft earthy scent of wet soil and fresh greenery, and observed how the flora along the creek had begun to respond, some plants standing taller, leaves stretching toward the light, their roots reaching into the replenished water with renewed vigor. Even small insects and birds moved cautiously back into the restored habitat, a testament to the subtle but undeniable change I had orchestrated. In the distance, I could see Viven Ashworth, her posture stiff and hesitant as she observed the creek from the edge of her property, the glint of disbelief in her eyes clear even from hundreds of feet away. I knew she had not anticipated the precision and care with which the creek had been restored, the way each legal right and historical water permit had empowered me to act confidently and within the boundaries of the law. The farmhouse, bathed in warm light, reflected in the gentle surface of the creek, seemed to glow with a sense of satisfaction, the wooden boards warming in the sun, windows capturing reflections of the vibrant green surrounding the property. Every detail I had attended to, from the exact angle of each sluice to the timing of water releases, had contributed to this moment, where control had shifted quietly but definitively, the creek responding not to force but to preparation, knowledge, and respect for its natural course. I crouched briefly, feeling the cool water lap over my fingers, smooth stones beneath the surface reminding me of how the land had guided each decision, every subtle cue in the environment serving as confirmation that the interventions were working as intended. The afternoon breeze carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, grounding me in the continuity of this landscape, and I realized that the restoration was not only about water flow, but about honoring a legacy, safeguarding a resource that countless generations had maintained, and asserting responsibility in a way that could not be ignored. I stood slowly, brushing off my hands, the sun warming my back, the gentle gurgle of the creek accompanying the rhythm of my thoughts, and I understood that this was the culmination of observation, planning, and careful execution, a demonstration that when knowledge, respect, and preparation combine, control and justice follow naturally, inevitable and enduring. The evening settled over the property, painting the hills and creek in soft amber and deepening shadows, the kind of light that made every leaf, blade of grass, and ripple in the water glow with subtle brilliance. I stood on the bank, watching the creek flow smoothly around the carefully placed sluices and barriers, each adjustment functioning perfectly, guiding the water along its natural course while honoring the legal rights and historical easements my family had maintained for generations. The faint scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the fresh aroma of the flowing water, creating a sensory confirmation that the restoration had succeeded beyond expectation. I traced the edges of the creek with my eyes, noting how the surrounding vegetation had begun to regain its vibrancy, the wildflowers swaying gently, and the small animals venturing back to the water's edge, evidence that the ecosystem was stabilizing. In the distance, Viven Ashworth lingered near the property line, her posture rigid and uncertain, clearly realizing that the influence she had once assumed over the land was no longer present, and that the quiet authority embedded in historical rights and careful preparation had shifted the balance irrevocably. I took a slow step along the creek, feeling the cool, firm soil under my boots, and reflected on the patience and meticulous attention to detail that had been required to reach this moment, every measurement, every observation, and every document contributing to a strategy that had been executed flawlessly. The farmhouse, bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun, seemed to mirror the satisfaction I felt, its windows reflecting the vibrant greens and blues of the land and water, the structure itself a testament to the generations of care and stewardship that had made this property what it was. As I breathed deeply, the subtle sounds of the creek lapping against the rocks, the wind whispering through the leaves, and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests created a rhythm that resonated with the precision and foresight of the actions I had taken, confirming that the land had responded exactly as intended. Every step along the bank reinforced the understanding that control had been regained without confrontation, that authority had been exercised with intelligence, respect, and adherence to both law and environmental integrity. I looked toward the horizon, where the sky transitioned from amber to deep blue, the stars beginning to punctuate the evening, and felt a sense of completion settle over me. The creek ran clear and strong, the ecosystem was recovering, and the responsibilities inherited from my family were honored, restored, and respected. The quiet triumph was as much about the land itself as it was about the knowledge, preparation, and deliberate action that had made this restoration possible. Standing tall, the warm evening air brushing against my skin, I acknowledged that justice had been served in its most patient, precise, and inevitable form, the balance of nature and law restored, and the legacy of the property secured for generations to come.